Good evening, everyone. My name is Susan Marks. I'm from the Law Department here at LSE, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome you to the annual lecture of the London Review of International Law. I know that the London Review of International Law will be bedside reading for everyone here, but just to remind you, this is an academic journal of international law focused on the critical study of international law broadly understood, the first issue of which came out in 2013. This annual lecture, linked to the journal, was instituted in memory of our dear and sadly missed colleague and friend at LSE, Deborah Cass. The subject of tonight's lecture is From Apology to Equality, Making Reparations for the Harm Done and the Damage to Come. If you mention the word reparations to someone in the field of international law, the first thing that will come to their mind is a judgment of the Permanent Court of International Justice in a case we call in English Chozov Factory, but I looked it up on Google and I gather the pronunciation should be something more like Hožus Factory, perhaps. I'm looking at my Polish former student, and he's nodding, so that may be approximately right. The judgment, in any event, was rendered in 1928, and the case concerned a factory situated in what, before the Treaty of Versailles, was Germany, but after it became Poland. The factory was expropriated by the Polish authorities, and the German government took the matter to the Permanent Court of International Justice, claiming that the expropriation breached a certain treaty commitment that Poland had made to Germany, and that accordingly Germany was entitled to reparations. The court found in favor of Germany, and in its judgment it laid out some important and still standardly quoted points about the nature and scope of reparations under international law. What is intriguing to note about this case is that the factory at Hožus, which the court said had been unlawfully taken from its German owner and should be the subject of reparations, was a nitrogen factory. It produced environmentally destructive agricultural fertilizers and during the First World War was a major center for the manufacture of munitions, explosives. During the Second World War, the chemical process it pioneered was used in the development of Zyklon B gas. So, in international law, the subject of reparations is fraught with irony and disaster. What of reparations more generally? To help us think through this concept, along with related matters in the diverse contexts in which it arises today, we have the wonderful Danny Dorling, whom it is now my very great pleasure and honor to introduce. Danny is Halford Mackinder Professor of Geography at the University of Oxford and a Fellow of St. Peter's College. His academic profile on Oxford's Geography Department website tells us that before entering academia, he was employed in preschool education in settings where the underlying philosophy was that playing is learning for living and that he tries not to forget that. Danny is the author of an astonishing number of amazing and hugely influential books and articles in which he has mapped and otherwise taken stock of inequality, both in this country and across the world, and both in terms of its present realities and in terms of its longer and quite specific history. His books Peak Inequality, Inequality and the 1%, and with Sally Tomlinson, Rule Britannia, Brexit and the End of Empire, are just a few of these many publications. His writings have changed the theory and practice of cartography and led us to see and understand the relationships between human populations and groups with a devastating and unprecedented clarity. Danny has held appointments at many prestigious institutions. He serves on many important committees and boards, and he is the recipient of an enviable number of honors and awards. It would take a long time to list them all, so I'm just going to mention one. In 2013, Danny was presented with the Political Studies Association's Political Studies Communicator Award for explaining complexity. I didn't know about that when I wrote to Danny to invite him, but I felt very happy when I saw it, as I'm sure you'll agree that it augurs extremely well for our lecture tonight. Please then join me in welcoming to the podium Professor Danny Dorling.
Thank you ever so much for that introduction. Thank you so much for coming. I'm probably going to make you work harder than you were anticipating. I'll explain why in a minute. I just wondered, I should have looked at the writing under that picture. I think that's Beatrice and Sydney Webb. I could be wrong, it is. Okay, one, but it's not. We can pretend it is anyway. And it's quite nice to start with them. Founders, I think, or some of the founders of the LSE. Halford Mackinder was also involved in founding the LSE. Sydney Webb famously drafted Clause 4 of the Labour Party, the first Clause 4, to secure for the workers by hand or by mind the fruits of their labour. And what's kind of interesting about that is there's something quite eugenic, even in the very first Clause 4 of the Labour Party. There are two kinds of people, those who use their hands and those who use their minds. And if you're interested in this kind of thing, Tony Blair rewrote Clause 4 of the Labour Party with a version which is also eugenic, to ensure that everybody can fulfil their potential, with the implication that there are people of varying potentials. So once you start to look for these things, it's kind of all around you. I've given you a kind of sense of why you're going to have to work hard, because there's going to be a certain kind of randomness about this. What you normally do when you're invited to give a lecture like this is you dust off the standard lecture you give that you've worked out how to do in 45 minutes, and you present it, and it's very polished. What I thought I would do, and the remit's up there, what I was kind of invited to do, which is really open, like do what you want to do. I thought I'd talk about something which I've never talked about in public before, which I've never published on, which I've done almost no research upon. And the reason for doing that is because this invitation to give a lecture also comes with an invitation to write a paper. And I really want to know how off-beam am I in what I actually think and believe about things that I don't normally talk about. I'm a geographer, not a lawyer. It should be obvious to you, but I should come clean about it. One definition of an academic is that you don't talk and write about things you don't know about. That's the difference between an academic and a journalist. If you ever get asked, will you comment on this, think, have I ever done any work on it? And if the answer is no, then don't comment on it. Geography is a subject that was rekindled, created in Britain, my department in Oxford in 1899, due to an appeal in the Times newspaper, to train young men in what they needed to know to run colonies. It's a colonial subject. My department often ranks number one in the world. At the moment, St Andrews does. This isn't that impressive because there aren't many geography departments in the world. Most British universities have a geography department. About 1 in 10 in the US do. There's one in Singapore. I won't go on and embarrass the subject. Very colonial, very British subject. And interestingly, still kind of at the heart of things, Theresa May, you may not know, studied geography at Oxford in St Hugh's College. What almost nobody knows is that Catherine Blakelock, who established the Brexit Party last year, also studied geography at Oxford, Christchurch College. There's only about 80 or 90 geographers a year. Oh, it's quite incredible how many people we've managed to produce who do certain things. Just for balance, Jeremy Corbyn's first job, when he was 18 and he went to Jamaica, and they didn't know what to do with Jeremy, so they said, Jeremy, you can teach geography. He hadn't learnt it, but you know, geography's nice and easy. And again, it's kind of attitude at things. And famously, the heir to the throne actually switched from fine art to geography I won't go into why. But a week or so ago, Kate said how terribly impressed she was by his geography, leading to that newspaper headline. Okay, the reasons, I'll leave that up. I like trying to explain why I'm doing this. I grew up in Oxford. I grew up in a mixed race family. And so we watched Roots in the 1970s. We supported the West Indies. I turned up at University in Newcastle at 18. I think I'm ever so knowledgeable and cocky because my family was a little bit different to other people's. Newcastle University, where I studied geography, in a building refurbished in the 60s with beautiful ship's lockers because all the shipyard workers had been laid off at the time. And there was a kind of sense that it was quite old, but I wasn't quite sure where it came from or what kind of legacy that place had. I moved down to Bristol to take a lectureship. Now, you don't have to be that quick to work out the legacy of Bristol University, or in fact the legacy of Bristol as a whole. It was a question of harm and who is most harmed. They used to pay the workers in the cigarette factory in cigarettes, which actually helps us establish just how harmful they are because you have the data for the cigarette workers. Then moved up to Leeds, and I won't try and get myself in any more trouble about talking about the kind of dodgy things about the University of Leeds. Switched over to Sheffield, where I was for 10 years, and soon after I arrived in Sheffield I came across a little pamphlet, and it was a pamphlet which was handed out to the steel workers of Sheffield just over 100 years ago, asking for penny donations to establish a university for their grandchildren. Hardly any of the grandchildren of steel workers in Sheffield go to Sheffield University nowadays. And again, legacy of a city, in case you didn't know, Sheffield's famous for cutlery. The master cutler's in charge. It doesn't actually make cutlery. Not very much. Sheffield makes something else out of metal, which is quite sharp, but we have ways of talking and hiding these things. And then 6 years ago I moved to Oxford, and that's why I'm talking about reparations, because I'd grown up in the city but left at 18. It almost hits you straight away. For a start, I couldn't work out who had established the chair I had in 1974. Oxford doesn't create professorships unless somebody hands over a large amount of money. But somebody decided that Halford Mackinder was such a splendid chap, I'll talk to you about him later, that the name should be immortalised for later. And I can go through many instances that I won't. The fathers of my two brothers were both born in Barbados. If you know about the Codrington Library, you'll know where the money came from that. I stupidly and naively once took a spoon from the library, not a silver spoon, just a normal one, because I'd calculated that there were so many descendants of the slaves from Barbados that actually it's only a spoon each once you work it out. But the thing which really shocked me, and I'll show you a load of slides in a minute, was a donation from what at the time was the 11th richest family in London of money to produce a building of a few million, not very many million, to be named after one of them. And I looked at how the family had become rich. And this is quite recent money. They become rich by, the father had become rich quite quickly by extracting oil from places where nobody else would extract oil. The Amazon and the Arctic simultaneously had well over £1 billion of wealth. And at this point, I'm quite new to the University of Oxford, I began imagining an Oliver Stone film. They also disturbed the last undisturbed tribe in the Amazon while extracting oil. And so it begins with a helicopter shot over the Amazon of the oil men coming in to put the drills in, and simultaneously you've got the ship in the Arctic going in to get the oil out there. And you've got this conglomerate getting bigger and bigger and making this enormous amount of money, billions. If his personal share was $1 billion, the whole thing had to be much bigger. And then at the end of the day, a tiny slice of a few million, and then you have a building. And the thing that struck me when I began to think about reparations is that the harm done is so absolutely enormous. The amount of damage done is so huge. And the buildings, not that many, that there is actually almost no way of thinking about repaying this. And there are many harms. I'm not going to talk that much because I don't know, apart from popular knowledge, much about slavery. I'm going to talk about different ones. And there's also a question about the ongoing harm. It's not all about legacy. There are still people who do disreputable things, whose monies universities take. My university recently, I won't say any more on this, given that his spokesman said that some comments attributed to me might be slander, and you're more qualified to know about me than these things. But it's interesting for academic freedom. When people give large gifts to a university, if as an academic you might say something about it, you might have to think that you could lose your house. You know, that's not necessarily a good thing. This is from a website, one of the most successful websites at the University of Oxford, and it's about carbon emissions. There was a point a few years ago when 1 in 7 of the additional carbon atoms up there was British. We're very proud because we'd taken so much out earlier and got it up. What this website says is that the distribution of emissions has changed significantly over time. The UK was until 1888, when it was overtaken by the US, the world's largest emitter. This is because the UK was the first country to industrialise, a transition which later contributed to massive improvements in living standards for much of its population. Now, the people who put this website together, and it has thousands of data sets, they're not being disingenuous, they're being completely honest about what they write. They're economists. And they do believe that the reason why Britain got rich was industrialisation. You know, think about 1888, and they just go, and it's very geographical. You take people from Africa, you ship them over to the Americas, they pick cotton, you ship that back to Manchester, where supposedly living standards are really high. Think about Manchester in the 1850s, 1860s. Actually, some of the shortest human beings we ever had. Life expectancy got down to 25 in Manchester. Anyway, they weave the cotton in Manchester, you ship it out, you particularly ship it to India, big market, you don't let people produce textiles in India, they need to do something else, you get some of them to grow opium, which you ship over through Hong Kong to China, completely destroying civilization there. Spectacularly geographical, spectacularly effective, and not really that much to do with the spinning jenny, to be honest. So there's a question about what we're currently doing. This is the harm to be done. We are still telling stories which are largely untrue, that conventional economics is good and makes the world a better place. I wish I had this graph further back in time. As I told you, human beings used to be about 6 foot tall for men. When they farmed, they get shorter, we know from skeletons. Once you put them in factories, they get even shorter. And the actual height going back up again, really, germ theory, social protests, trade unions, suffragettes, women's movement. 1910 onwards is when you actually see the big boost in height, not 1888. And this is the image that accompanies that text. Ways of telling stories about things. Who currently emits the most CO2? And you look at that. Things you need to know about images, by the way, is that your eye automatically goes to red first. It's something to do with the cones. Blue goes into the background, you don't tend to see blue, goes back, red comes forward. And you look at that, and you say, China absolutely enormous, USA a lot smaller, EU 28 still, just about the same. But of course, this is what the world looks like in terms of people. China's bigger, Europe's smaller. USA is really small, so per capita it's a different kind of a message. Quote from a colleague of mine, Very proud to have this colleague, as he's one of the people who helped set the 1.5 degree C number. But again, you can contest these things. You can contest everything. You can certainly, and you get your chance, because I'm not going to overrun, you can contest me and tell me how not to be so stupid, so when I write this up, I look as if I know more about what I'm talking about. Climate change is not so much an emergency as a festering injustice. Your ancestors did not end slavery. It's interesting. If you have a British education, you're all taught about how we ended slavery. By declaring an emergency and dreaming up artificial boundaries on tolerable slave numbers, they called it out for what it was, a spectacularly profitable industry, the basis for much prosperity at the time, founded on a fundamental injustice. It's a useful rhetoric for what's going on now. I was attending a talk at the RSA at 1 o'clock today, and Pettifor was given it. He's the author of the New Green Deal. And what was really interesting, I thought she gave a brilliant talk. It's all recorded, so you can see this. She talked for about 25 minutes, and a member of the audience lost it. He completely lost it. Really rude, shouting out, "That's rubbish, you can't possibly do that. If you curtail the oil and coal industry, then," I think it was the Saudis and the Iranians and some other groups. Makes the talk really, I'm not egging you on, but when a member of the audience actually loses it halfway through and had to almost be physically restrained, it's much more exciting than your average talk to do that. So it's maybe this is the kind of thing we need, and maybe we need to use the rhetoric that people understand to explain how quickly things need to change if we are to survive in the way we currently are. But of course there's the question of, well, who was to blame for what damage is going to come and already has come. Let's go way back to damages. And just people. You won't have seen this kind of graph before, and just to really confuse you, it's on a log scale, so I'm sorry. But it's a kind of potted world history of the total population of the world for the last 2,000 years. And the point is it tends to go up, but because it's a log scale, actually it wasn't going up very much in the past. And there are some particular points of dramatic change. And each time you get a point of dramatic change, afterwards you get a population acceleration. The first really big dramatic change, this is forgetting the plague of St. Justinian and the Black Death and so on, which were actually smaller in their overall effect, is 1492 and turning up with the germs. And again, you probably know, so I won't insult you, but the world may have lost up to 10% of its population when us Europeans, with our old world germs, turned up in the new world. So absolutely devastating. And this is a question I've really got for lawyers. So I'm interested in questions of knowledge and intent. You know, clearly, nobody knew what a germ was then. I think the Nobel Peace Prize for germ theory was 1905, which is partly why the people begin to get higher, because you're less stunted from illness. But go to the next one. 1820 to 1850 is the next slowdown in world population. That was largely us. We, Britain, invaded 171 of what are now the 193 members of the United Nations. It's an incredible record, never to be bettered. Exactly 90%, 171. And what happens when you do that, even before they'd been sent to geography departments, remember, what happens when you do invade what generally were very stable social systems, think Australia, you know, some claims of 50,000 years of stability. The initial effect is people die. But the secondary effect is the social system whereby population numbers were kept under control because you had a particular set of religions, you behaved in a certain way, that is all destroyed. And then you see huge rises in population. The nice thing, the curve at the end, and I will try and do good news stories on this, is for the first time ever for women who are young in the audience, not the men I'm afraid on average, young women in the audience, you may live long enough to see the size of this species stabilise and fall for the first time ever without disease, war, pestilence or death. We're actually slowing down. Probably largely due to the changing position of women in society, but we don't really know. There's the statistic, nice source, Gordon Brown. You can quibble with it, but at least a former Prime Minister knew this, and a painting of the carving up of the world. But they didn't know, you might say. We didn't know, it was just normal to do. The Belgians were worse. There's a kind of common thing that's said, in a kind of league table of which empire was nastiest. And then you were taught by listing the famines in India, heading up to the ones that killed 10 or 11 billion people at one time. And I'm interested in this. I don't have an answer, but quite often what I see when I attend other talks and read things is there seems to be a necessity to demonstrate that the person you're particularly annoyed about in the past, or the one you want to remove the statue of, or so on, was known at the time as being especially evil. And the Manchester Guardian wrote about how terrible they were. John Cecil Rhodes is one example. Halford Mackinder is another, where there's been some great scholarly work showing that Mackinder was actually unusually vicious and nasty. I'm not sure that that's necessary, given the scale of things. If you were unaware of the size of the British Empire, then this little map of the world is an attempt to show. I sometimes cynically tell students, because it's amazing they don't know, when we were invited in, and the date at which we cordially left, having imposed civilization upon a place. It's amazing, quite often you can say that and an audience believes you in Britain, given the way we educate people. I wrote a book with our friend Sally Tomlinson on this. And stories we tell ourselves. We've got so much work to do to change the stories that we tell ourselves. This is kind of like the least brutal story, which is the Chancellor of my university, Chris Patten, man who established the changes to Hong Kong just before the handover, but I won't go any further than that. Wiping the tears from his daughter's eyes as the flag is lowered and the sun sets over the last but one colony of Britain. Don't know, let's work out. How many of you are old enough to remember watching Hong Kong going and her crying? Yep. And that was the Rhetoric. It was this thing is such a sad thing. Royal Yacht Britannia is there to take them away. I should show you the full picture because it's got a wonderful, just to the side of there is a completely gormless and panic-stricken Prince Charles, who obviously does not know what to do with a young woman crying. And that's the kind of story we tell ourselves. And just the simplest one, this is the kind of least painful kind of debunking of empire things. She said why she was crying. She was a teenager. It had nothing to do with the empire, of course. She couldn't understand why Mum and Dad weren't going to let her stay in Hong Kong, which they could have done, because her boyfriend was there and he was from Australia and he was really, really good at surfing and she really liked him. And she cried for 3 hours solid that day and the BBC recorded it endlessly. That's our leaving Hong Kong. And you can do this again and again and again of things. Here's the annual population change in the world from when we go from 1 billion to now about 7.7 billion. And so it's just a percentage change in people, just to kind of point out the coincidence in timing with the spread of the dominance of the British in particular around the world. The acceleration after it fell because of the initial colonisation, then the acceleration from 1850 onwards to 1% a year growth by 1900, punctuated occasionally by First World War, but actually the flu was far more important, punctuated by a Second World War, reaching population growth of 2% a year in the 60s, completely unsustainable population growth, which is why people wrote books like The Population Bomb. Just think about money. if there was no inflation and you were getting 2% on your savings, it doesn't take too many decades for you to become incredibly rich. That was probably largely the British. Now, but is it a bad thing? Most people in the world, most of you wouldn't be alive if it wasn't for the population explosion. Your grandparents wouldn't have been born. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. Let me give you one more example that we've only just found out. It's published in a paper in February this year by the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And it's a wonderful paper because it's by people not looking for the result. The population of Africa is currently predicted to get to 4 billion, I think, in the next 81 years. And the question is why? Because if I could bore you endlessly with population charts. When the rest of the world was slowing down in fertility, the slowdown in fertility in Africa didn't slow down quite as fast in the 1980s and 90s. So what happened? This paper suggests that the coincidence really fits very closely with structural adjustment and the IMF and the World Bank. You had to show a sign as a country in Africa in debt that you were willing to make real cuts that really hurt to show you really cared. Things like privatising the water supply and so on. But one of the cuts was to education. When you're told to cut education, what do you cut first? You cut what you introduced most recently, which was secondary education for girls. Secondary education for girls is cut across the continent of Africa to satisfy the World Bank and the IMF, people from the USA and from Europe and so on. And if a girl doesn't go to secondary education, what happens? She has her first child earlier and she tends to have more children. That's 1 billion. And whenever I hear people say, when I say don't worry about world population, it's slowing down, they say, what about all those people in Africa? I think, well, there's a reason why there'll be more. But we didn't know. But still, does it matter? I'm slightly fascinated by this man. I don't know. Does anybody recognise him? No? There's no reason you should. I just wondered. Great leaders. He is a great leader, former Prime Minister. I'll show you who he is in a minute. These are those strange graphs again for, nearest to me, India and China. Population numbers in billions going up, how fast it's increasing per year in millions on the side. I think that's opium poppies put around Hong Kong then. And again, just to show you it's coming down. Populations stabilising, both India and China in the future. And you'll know lots of stories like this one. This is Jason Hickel's story about 45 trillion being expropriated from India. If you ever wondered why Britain joined the European community in the 1970s, it was, as was often said at the time, to find new markets because we were not doing very well. Why were we not doing very well? Well, it wasn't the trade unions, and it wasn't the immigrants, and it wasn't the women's libbers, and it wasn't Labour. If you are the heart of the biggest empire the world has ever known, and it's finally managed to get free, then by the 1970s, all the huge advantages that you had, because they bought your ships, which were not that great, rather than ships from somebody else, and they bought your cotton because they were kind of told to, that kind of goes. So you join the European community, and then you get really, really upset when you don't manage to exploit them either. But let's go forward. So naively wanting to expand this away from the really obvious questions of damage done, the ones that are talked about a lot, and I'll come back to them at the very end, and I'll talk about what can universities do. To think about this much, much bigger thing. Things can be bigger in quantitative numbers of people. This graph is showing you the worst case scenario for biodiversity loss according to the index produced by the Zoological Society. They're very nervous about their index. climate change deniers. Can you remember when climate change deniers used to attack all scientists who were saying it's warming? And they largely stopped about 10 years ago as it became really obvious it's getting hotter. But it didn't go away. What they did is they now target people who say we've got species extinction, going, can you really show the data? Have you counted every species in the world? That kind of thing. Well, this is the worst case scenario from the Zoological Society, and it's actually slowing down. When these graphs move this way, it means the rate of species extinction is slowing down. That's because there were lots of very rare species in the 70s and 80s, and largely on islands, which were the easiest ones to wipe out. The really good news about the fact it's slowing down, I know this is trite, so I shouldn't. If it hadn't slowed down, this is 70% of, I think, animals, mammals, larger animals, not insects. If the rate of species extinction was still at the rate it was in the 1970s and 80s, we'd all be gone. So it kind of has to slow down for us to be there. But this is huge. This is huge. We don't yet know the damage. And you don't have to make a species extinct to have a huge effect. Just by becoming small enough, it no longer plays its part in the way that things work. There's loads and loads of kind of discoveries at the moment of how we had a different idea about how things work to how we now think they work. And quite obviously, in 10 years' time and 20 years' time, we'll think again. I won't read this one out. This is just Science magazine from April 2019. And the reason for putting the quote up is just to show you the standard maps that are now produced. And you get these incredible animated maps of every single ship moving across the kind of detailed anatomy of a form of Holocaust going on. I personally don't think we have to establish ability or knowledge to talk about blame. This is Palmerston. Went to Cambridge. They've named a room after him in St John's College. That's the ghost of Palmerston. He's the man who said we had to gunboat our way into Hong Kong to protect free trade in opiates. And at the time, famously, he was denounced in Parliament as being beyond the pale for brutality. I just may be completely wrong. I may have a different kind of morality for other people. I'm not that interested in individual appropriation of an individual knowing that what they're doing is terribly wrong. The example I'll give you is cars. I work with a charity called Road Peace who are very, very much into if somebody hits somebody and kills them, they should be taken to court and prosecuted. My view about this is that we shouldn't be maintaining a system which requires people to have to drive a ton of steel and metal around, which is the most lethal thing you can possibly do. It's the most common way in which a child between age 5, and an adult up to 25 die in this country. It's actually establishing that. And we always forget that for everybody who's died being hit by a car, there's somebody walking around who knows they did it, which is quite a lot of punishment itself. Palmerston. How much of his brutality was, I think he's another one from Eton. I could be wrong, but on average you get it right if you say that with some of them. How much of his brutality is simply his childhood? How much of his arrogance was what he was taught at his university? My friend Sally Tomlinson has managed to get a copy of one of the textbooks that Boris Johnson was taught from at his prep school in the 70s. It contains the words pickaninnies and watermelon smiles in the textbook. You know, where do you go back to where you attribute blame? And I worry about things like this, adding up atrocities. And there are atrocity studies which I wouldn't humanly manage to do. After a few weeks of doing it, I would find it hard. So let's go back to the environment and CO2. This is massive. I sometimes kind of think there is a God. The reason I think don't want to insult anybody about this, just my personal. It's quite magical that the relationship between carbon dioxide and a few other gases and temperature is linear. Couldn't have made it more simple for us. The more you put in, the hotter it's going to get. Not some kind of complicated S-shaped function or whatever. But of course, when they were beginning with Bedlam, they had no idea. There's interesting as an earlier period in 1100 of the Chinese takeoff of industrialization and steel making, before luckily the Moguls swept in and destroyed it. So at least it was a bit later. And I got another one of these graphs showing you the rise, very early rise in carbon emissions up to 1910, going to 2 to 3 billion tons of CO2 a year entering the atmosphere. And I quite like that picture of Iron Bridge, just for the smog and the weather over the top of it. And here's that same graph brought up to date. If you've got really good eyesight, we're now heading towards 38 billion tons a year and accelerating. As it moves that way, it accelerates away from me. So the vertical axis is how much, and the horizontal is whether it's going down or up. And one really sad thing is that every time we have a summit, Rio, Kyoto, Paris, it kind of accelerates straight after summit, and I think because people think they've done something, but it's also related to economic crashes and so on. But people are going to ask in future about this enormous pollution. What are you going to pay for what you have done? And you can produce a world map with China as a huge slab of red, but the huge slab of red gets dramatically smaller once you subtract all the things that are made in China but ship over here and you move the carbon over here. It's actually unbelievably exponential, the distribution of kind of blame on this. I think there's a Guardian article yesterday. 1% of people who fly use 25% of flights in this country. The majority of people on Ryanair and EasyJet are social class A, B, C1. The poor in this country do not fly. Let's just do a little quick survey. Who has not flown since the 1st of January this year? I'm not going to ask one, maybe. Who's flown just once? Who's flown twice? 3 times? 4 times? 5 times? I'll stop because we're not going to do any shaming. And of course, it's fun to do this in universities, particularly if you're teaching international master's students who are studying the environment. And you're trying to get them not to blame total population numbers and people in poor countries for the problems we've got in the world. Optimism, just a little bit of optimism. When I was the age of our master's students in Oxford, I was fairly sure I was going to die. I was fairly sure I was going to die quite quickly and brutally, because a few years before, when I was 16, the nuclear clock had got to 3 minutes to midnight. We had the Soviet Union and America rushing towards annihilation. The hippies knew in the 1960s that most people were going to be dead in a few weeks. It took until the 1980s for a social scientist to take the square leg attack, which was the government's published and predicted set of cities that would be hit, the government report on the effects of a 1 megaton bomb, and the 1981 census, put 2 of them on top of the census and find that 30 million will be dead or dying within 2 weeks. And the lovely thing then, when that happened, is that John Major, Maggie wouldn't believe it, when John Major became Prime Minister, he decommissioned all the secret bunkers. They're no longer secret. We have a bunker every 8 miles in this country. Those bunkers were established shortly after 1945. They kept on the people who were doing air watch during the Second World War, normally the sub-postmaster, and you would go, 3 of you would be there, had a periscope. You can go and visit one in Broadway Village in the Cotswolds if you're interested. And you would go in when a nuclear war was thought to be imminent, and you'd look for where the mushroom cloud is so that you could radio into the central bunker and tell them, because we thought nuclear war was survivable. The thing that warms me about this particular story, and of course we could still die, but it's interesting that even with Trump, people are not that worried because there are now checks in place, is that we have actually dealt partially with a huge and substantial threat to the existence of the species within my lifetime once already. The difficulty is that the nuclear war threat was nice and simple. It could happen any time. The problem with climate change is it's going to be worse for your children than you, and worse for your grandchildren than them, but we have a tendency to discount other people. Most things are slowing down in the world, but here's the flights. 2 years ago, latest data, 4 billion flights a year and accelerating. While at the same time, more and more people are born every year who will never ever fly an aeroplane. You just look up and see them. So what about that injustice in future? Things we think of as perfectly normal behaviour today, going to Heathrow and getting that flight to that very important conference or that holiday you really need, could be the equivalent of behaviour in the 16th century, which we now say was terrible. So this is why I sort of really stick my foot in it. There's so much. There's just so much that has been done that is wrong, and there is harm to come. And we don't yet know the half of it, because there'll be things we're doing now which we don't know. I'm obsessed by this sign on Virgin Trains, the one that says, "We want everyone to have a great journey, so please consider others around you." It makes you slightly worry about human beings, if it's necessary to remind us about other people. Mackinder, I promised you very quickly to tell you about Mackinder. He was your standard fascist. He became a Conservative and Unionist MP. He led an expedition to Russia to try to stop the revolution, resulting in mass slaughter of white Russians. He climbed a mountain, because that's what you did to show you were a man, and allowed the slaughter of 8 of his porters along the way, and many, many more things. And so in my university, they're talking about the name of my chair, the name of the lecture theatre in my department, and so on. And they talk about Cecil Rhodes. And you get these very patronising talks about you can't rewrite history. My favourite thing about not rewriting history is have a look at the history page on Rhodes House in Oxford. They have a page on the website about our history. And then go to the Wayback Machine, because you know everything's recorded on the Wayback Machine on the web. They've changed their history page. So sorry. We always rewrite history. Even Rhodes House rewrites its history. Bringing it forward, just about five more minutes or so. I'm okay. The current controversy, and then what can we do? And over what we can do, I'm going to go really, really, really narrow. Just like, what can we do? This is a lovely room. You know, we are actually halfway up a tower block, aren't we? We're not in a country house. This is a 6th floor, right? But it's kind of looks like the old and ancient university. This year, 30th of April, was when Cambridge came out with its "we're going to begin to examine where we got some of our money and endowment from." I'll leave this one up a bit longer. Really interesting to look at the statements that are made. We're ever so sorry we got some money from the slave trade, but we were only started in 1909, you know. And you can read about the names of the buildings and so on. Massive Attack are going to play the renamed Colston Hall, by the way, finally. it's kind of like a vogue at the moment. It's a vogue where you go round and I can imagine the council meeting of these universities. We must do something. What can we do? Let's set up an inquiry. Who on earth are we going to get to chair the inquiry? I don't want to mock. I think apologies are really important. It's good to apologise. It's the first step. But there's so much more. What role does the University of Bristol, where I worked as a young lecturer, actually have? What does it do today? Who gets in? What is the purpose of master's courses in the University of Bristol? What does that actually do for the society that we're in? What if you can't afford to do a master's? What are your choices in life then? How wonderful is the university? I gave a talk a little bit like this to the chairs of university councils a few weeks ago. I was trying to be subtle because if you're chair of a university council, you tend to think your university is the most wonderful thing. They're often giving up their time for free plus some expenses. And I showed them a series of pictures of British universities and how they sat inside their cities as the point of the divide often between rich and poor areas, where the cleaners came from, where the lecturers came from, how the university often sits at the apex of social division and maintaining what is the most socially divided country in Europe. And this carries on. My university, we now take in the children of the 0.1% from around the planet. The equivalent of Sebastian from Brideshead Revisited. Sebastian's fictional friend, who narrates Brideshead, by the way, had an allowance of only £550 a year. Sebastian got a lot more. Halford Mackinder wrote a letter complaining about his salary because it was only £500 a year. So students in Oxford in the 1920s were actually better off than the professors. The equivalents of Sebastian today are far more subtle and knowledgeable. And it's progress. I see that the equivalence of Sebastian today, he's called Zeb. He's from the USA, and he's brilliant at hiding the fact that Daddy has $300 million of wealth. And he's doing a master's course. And he doesn't puke in the fountain. So things are getting better. But exactly the same process of rubber stamping the existing order as being okay is going on. I've left that up for you long enough to look at Bristol. Glasgow, 20 million, actually given some money. There's a lot happening in Scotland. As far as I understand it, all the Vice-Chancellors of Scotland have now given up their chauffeurs. Things are altering. 20 million, which I think will somehow work its way to University of West Indies. So putting its money more where its mouth is than the other ones. If you're interested in schools, you can have great fun looking at the old schools. My favourite in Scotland is the Dollar Academy, where the current editor of The Spectator went. And I'll let you look up the history of the Dollar Academy and where it got its cash from. My own university keeps remarkably quiet so far about all of this. I suspect because the problem is bigger at Oxford than any of the others put together. And it isn't just the international harm done. These were the school exam results that came out 2 weeks ago for the city of Oxford. And they shocked me. And I'm not easily shocked because I'm the weird nerd who just collects numbers all the time. Matthew Arnold School, these are the state schools actually outside the city. The Charwell School, Tatler recommended comprehensive, 64% GCSE passes. Cheney, Oxford Spires, which has been renamed rather like Toxteth and Riverside. Gregory the Great, which is a school that's been renamed, rather like Windscale and Sellafield. The Oxford Academy, which has been renamed, and so on. Down to just 17% of children getting, in this case, in new money, 9 to 5 scores in GCSE maths and English. The divides between the state schools of Oxford are worse than they were when I was a child growing up in that city. It's incredible. What has this got to do with the University of Oxford? When the University of Oxford employs cleaners at below the Oxford living wage, which is £10 and magically 2p an hour, really important, £10 2p, not £10, £10 2p. When you realise the 2p matters, you begin to get it. When you employ cleaners at less than £10 2p an hour, the cleaner tends to work part-time 20 hours a week. The cleaner doesn't have a spare £500 a year. Why do you need £500 spare a year? Because £500 is what a semi-decent second-hand computer and printer costs. Why do you need a second-hand computer and printer? Because your son's doing GCSEs. Because you can't do GCSEs now and get a good score without a computer and a printer. Because all the middle class have got a computer and a printer and they can actually access the things that you need. What does my university do? And I do like my university, I just want it to get better. I'm not sure. Sends endless well-meaning children from the upper classes off to the estates to help kids with their homework who don't have a second-hand computer and a printer. And it's not a question of money. The amount of money it would take to pay the staff at the bottom is tiny. It's a question of principle. Where the principle is, these people should not be paid more because the money should go for a book prize for a student. Just going to quickly show you what happens in Germany, just to show you it can be very different. Sometimes people don't know that the rest of Europe is largely different to how we are. They don't charge fees, or hardly any fees. It's a metro pass to use. And they don't charge fees to international students either. It's great to do this in LSE, Oxford's no better. Utterly unimaginable. As unimaginable as thinking you wouldn't have slave plantations in the past is to think, how the hell would you run the LSE or Oxford without the fee income from the students, particularly the overseas ones? Well, Germany does. So then you'll think, oh, well, Germany will only have a few international students then. It can't possibly do that. I wrote an article with my friend who luckily happened to be German, was born in Switzerland, 2017 on this, because English researchers of universities often try to claim that fewer young people go to university in Germany, and the great thing about fees is it opens up freedom. In Germany, they get very angry when vice-chancellors take an extra £55,000 in 6 years and stop it happening again. That's the kind of place they are in Germany. And here are the numbers if you are nosy about it. 732,000 babies born in 1995 in the UK, slightly more, 765,000 in Germany. 21 years later, there were more students graduating who are German from German universities than from UK ones. You can have more young people going to university and not charge fees. But even more interesting than that, since 1995, German universities have been making these efforts to recruit more foreign students, even though they don't pay fees. Even though they won't, and this is interesting if you've got kids, if we were to leave the EU and become third country status, doesn't matter. Germany lets students in, or at least it did 2 years ago. Occasionally the Bavarians get a bit edgy. 0.36 million. The German coalition government set a target of 350,000 by the year 2020. They exceeded that 3 years early. You go to the museum in a small German town I went to over the summer, with a university town, there's a sign saying what the fee is to go into the museum, and next to it says refugees free. Can you imagine that in Britain? A sign saying refugees enter for free. And it's not as if the Germans are the most wonderful people in the, it's just they're not Scandinavian. We can raise it a bit. There were different ways of doing things. So what could we do? And I got a simple suggestion. I was trying to look for a camera in this room. Can anybody see? Is there a camera? Or if there is, maybe there isn't. So it will be slightly harder. You can argue slowly. My university is trying to find a billionaire to fund some studentship so you can let some people in. His dad doesn't have $300 million hidden away. And you can sort of slowly change who's going to your university and make it more based on who really loves libraries rather than who's expected to go. But that's still quite elitist. A place like the middle of London, these blocks here, or my city of Oxford, there's only a certain amount of space. You can't actually get more people in. You can argue that we should be heading to a university system which is common in most of the rest of the world and Scotland, where most of you simply go to the nearest local university. It's great fun arguing that in Oxford. We used to have a local university, it was called Oxford Poly, now ABB, AAB. We are a black hole for universities on the map of areas lacking a university, where I come from. You could think about doing all of that, and people are, and they'll go for a huge amount of effort. But the other thing you could do, and this is my sort of weird small suggestion, most of the lecture rooms that I lecture in now have a camera. And the camera is turned on if we have a student who's part-time who happens to be in Australia. We turn the camera on and we say, you can see the lecture. Well, why not just turn the cameras on? Forget the complicated access system so that only your students can see. There's a lovely beach down in New Zealand I really like. And if I'm feeling down, I just click on it and look at the camera. We have 4 million CCTV cameras. This is years ago, it'd be more now. Just put the cameras on in the lecture theatres, just leave them on. I may be naive and okay for younger colleagues who are very, very nervous, maybe it's horrible. But it will certainly help with lecturers saying things which were particularly bigoted, because at least you'd know that the world was going to see you say it. But also it helps reduce the mystique. The idea that there's something really special going on in there. It might be great, it might not, it's probably largely boring. By the time we've got to this far through the lecture, I know that at least 60% of you are wiggling your bums and thinking, what are you going to do later? And will he really wrap up on time? Putting the cameras on would reduce the mystique. All those complicated web systems that we have, which change every 4 years for downloading our student material, just stick it up on a normal website. Don't hide it. It's far easier. Why not? What are you afraid of? And I'm not talking about some giant MOOC, I'm just saying open it up. I disliked the University of Oxford like most children who grew up in Oxford, but I disliked it for an unusual reason, because I was weird. I like libraries. But because I was a local child, I could only go to 2, the Bowie Knoll Library in the park, which had books for 5-year-olds, and Oxford City Library, which is a tiny set of rooms in the Westgate shopping centre. I was aware that there were other libraries. I remember there was no internet when I was a child. I thought there were 50. Turns out there's 100 libraries in the University of Oxford. Turns out in term time the kids from local schools still aren't allowed in them. But it kind of doesn't matter, because we've got the web now. You know, unless you're interested in really rare books or something that nobody else wants to read that's stored there, it's not so protected. But we're left with the mystique that something special's going on. So it's a tiny, tiny suggestion, but just put the cameras on and leave them on all the time. People will still come, they'll still pay, because you give them a bit of paper and make them take an examination. It won't go away straight of all, but just things that will be possible to do. We're living in a really connected world. This ship was the largest ship in the world a few years ago, contained so many containers that when they unloaded them in Rotterdam, if the lorries had been end to end, it would be 100 kilometres long. We are in many ways not a divided world anymore, but of course it's easy for me to say that because I can still fly largely around the world, although my passport, which was the most effective passport a year ago, is looking more dodgy now. Just a couple more slides for you. This is PISA results and about ability and why we need to raise it. We have a very strange idea in England that we think we're very, very good. We particularly think we're good on our universities, because a small newspaper on Red Lion Square produces a list of what are the best universities and tends to rank ones like ours very, very high. At the bottom you've got income inequality, along the side you've got a PISA assessment of maths ability in different countries of children at 18, and you'll see that the UK and the USA is fairly low along with Greece in that case. That's taken at 15. When you do the same maths test for people aged 16 to 24, it all lines up wonderfully. And I could very happily give you this summer's maths GCSE exam now, and we could see how well you do at maths. And you will probably have, none of you are young enough to have numbers, none of you are so old you can have numbers, because we used to give people numbers. You're probably A-star, A, B, GCSE students. But also you're probably over averagely the ones who are taught how to get an A-star, A or B on the day, because that's what matters in an unequal country. And this is hard to lecture about in Britain, because we're really into grades, just like the Americans are into 4.0 GPA scores. Good education in something like maths, but also literacy and problem solving, is something that stays with you a few years after you've had it, so that when somebody tests somebody up to age 24, they can still do maths problems. And I think we've got enormous problems because we have set ourselves up with this image that we are so very good, and because we have to. There are 30 universities in this country which claim on the very first website that you hit, the very first page, one of the statistics they have is that they're in the top 10. 30 UK universities claim to be on the top 10. Click on the web page of a university in Denmark or the Netherlands or France and look at their front page. It's so different. This is almost my penultimate slide. Desperate reasons for hope, and also a very strange animating graph. This is student debt in the USA, rising up past $1 trillion, 1.2 trillion, 1.3, 2016, there it goes up. And that kind of looks a bit like a nightmare scenario, but notice how it was really accelerating 2007, 2008, 2009, and then the slope comes back. On almost everything in the world, apart from carbon emissions, temperature, air flights, and the number of graduates, the slope has started going back. That's what I've spent the last 2 years trying to measure. Still getting worse, something's changing. Number of babies being born in the world is going down dramatically. Consumption per head is slowing of material goods in many, many parts of the world. People are getting cleverer, more educated despite the inequality. They're living longer, they're wiser. The way in which we've been doing things for years and years and years is not going to work in future. The kind of way of conning people that there is this huge difference in ability between some people and others, and that we will pluck the superhuman, eugenically special people out and give them a master's or a PhD from the most prestigious places just to stamp the fact that they have enormous brains. That thing is going to start looking embarrassing when you say it. The golden children that you search for, the creme de la creme. The kind of thing that Sidney Webb believed in. Beatrice and Sidney were members of the Eugenics Society. Sidney may even actually have chaired it at one point. My last slide, so please think of some questions. I know it's inadequate to talk about just turning a camera on in a lecture theatre, but I'm trying to think of things that are possible, things that are easily possible, things where it's very hard to say, why don't you do that? It's going to change slowly how we behave and what we think. This last picture is the statue of Rhodes, the highest statue on the High Street in Oxford. Rhodes, as you will know, oversaw the slaughter of very large numbers of people, including many children who were forced down the diamond mines in Africa. And so I'll end with one tiny story for you. And there were numerous roads must fall campaigns, and new students turn up in Oxford and try again, roads must fall. There's where you worry about degrees of sensibility or so on. The colleges of Oxford share one cherry picker. You know, a cherry picker is one of those little cranes that lets you get up high. It's held in New College, which is remarkably near to where the road statue is. So if anybody actually ever did want to remove the statue, and seriously, what worries me is that you could lasso over the head and pull it down, and there are people sleeping on the street beneath it. And I do worry. I told students at SOAS just before they did that riot not to drop anything off a high building, and what they did, they went and bloody dropped a fire extinguisher off a building. Rhodes, he's stepping out, he looks suicidal. He wasn't just terrible in all kinds of ways and terrible for his time. He may, according to a BBC documentary, also possibly have been a paedophile. Highest statue in the High Street of Oxford. In 1989, the school I went to after I had left it had 4 houses. It decided it was an average, about bog standard average comprehensive in Oxford. And they're doing it again. It decided it must have houses and house points to try to pretend to be like a private school, because that gets you the kind of ethos and prizes. And one of the 4 houses was Rhodes' house. And on sports day, the children had to run for Rhodes. And one of the children decided not to run for Rhodes. And then all the children decided not to run for Rhodes. And then there wasn't a sports day. 1989, 2 miles from that statue. And the next year, they renamed it Martin Luther King House. It's as easy as that. So the question I'll leave you with is, how can a group of children from average housing in Oxford take Rhodes down in their school, but the supposed most brilliant brains in the world that we collect together in a university 30 years later still don't manage to actually do it? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It turns out children know best. We've seen that very clearly recently, if we needed reminding. So from a master cartographer, we've had a fantastic visual and verbal map of harm and recompense, I think, tonight. We've heard about slavery, climate change, and species extinction, but we've also heard about the harms associated with inequality, asymmetries in the distribution of social goods and opportunities by reference to class, gender, and age. And then we've heard about recompense, we've heard about apology, about financial reparations of various kinds, but also about simple, everyday forms of recompense. Providing computers and printers, turning on cameras in universities. What constitutes appropriate reparations? How are we to understand the forms of harm that should be preoccupying us? So Danny, I think, has put a huge range of issues on the table for us. We have, I think, about 15 minutes, 10 minutes perhaps, to discuss some of those many issues. Who would like to start?
May I just ask a question?
Yes. I think there may be a microphone going around, which perhaps you might like to use so that people at the back can hear you.
Thank you very much. I noted, Danny, that you expressed some view that things are getting better in some ways, and I'm sure you're aware of Hans Rosling and his book Factfulness, and I just wondered, do you look ahead with optimism or pessimism?
Shall I stand up? Yeah, take some more.
Since we're pretty short of time, I wonder if we might take a few. Anyone else like to? Yes, over here. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for giving this talk today, this really important talk. I guess my question really, well, I'll just kind of backtrack. So Extinction Rebellion, which I'm sure hopefully everyone has heard about, just in regards to climate change or the climate crisis, there was nothing out of LSE, no kind of solidarity across any kind of universities, I feel, although there's numerous scientists, professors, academics coming out saying that we're about to face a sixth mass extinction in 2100. So my big thing is, how do you, working within an institution, get the college itself to change its curriculum, to kind of change its attitude? What are your fears if there's any kind of action against you from that institution, and what can you suggest students to do to work in coordination?
Great.
Can I do those two, because my memory's no good?
Please do.
Okay.
Yes, great.
Hans Vossen was brilliant, I think. I think he got the balance roughly right between optimism and pessimism. I could do an hour of happiness for you, of which by far the happiest thing is that a few years ago, infant mortality rates across the entire world were dropping by 10% a year. There were fewer grieving parents alive today than there were 30 years ago, despite the fact there were far few people 30 years ago. And a child dying is the worst thing that can happen. The 10% drop in a year has never happened before and can never happen again, because infant mortality cannot go below zero. And there are some incredible things going on, but incredibly worrying things at the same time happening, which leads me on to Extinction Rebellion. It is incredible to see. The last time there was anything, there were arrests to do with the miners' strike and arrests to do, but that's people being attacked. The last time there was anything like 1,000 arrests, which they were at Easter and now again, was here. It was 1968, LSE, wasn't 1,000, what was it, 2 dozen? That was the most students had ever done before. It's incredible. Universities are involved. I ask our American DPhil students not to get arrested because they can be deported, but to help. Don't know if I'm helping or not. There are more scientists than you think. A lot of them are not that open that they're involved, and Extinction Rebellion is run by a cell system. There is nobody in charge. So scientists can be involved and nobody knows, and you can't decapitate it, which is what they're finding out in that big building on the Thames, where our masters who look at the enemy within live. There is no way of stopping it other than boredom of the protesters. But universities are naturally conservative things. We are the temples of today. We are the temples of the truth. We're essentially a religion. We don't tend to act out. I'm in the School of Geography and the Environment. We have 100 climate change scientists in my building, which means that we carry a trestle table down to the square when the kids do a protest, which is more than anybody else does, but it's just carrying one trestle table down. And some leaflets that kind of say, we're not all going to die in 12 years, it's going to be really bad, but than that. Universities bullying people. It's interesting. I got something weird about my character. When I was 3, the person, the Don's wife who ran the playgroup, complained about my behaviour to my mother and wanted me taken out of my playgroup, which is partly, I think, why I became a play worker. I have 3 times in my life been pulled in front of vice-chancellors to be told off. But it doesn't happen in Oxford because we actually have academic freedom, and they're scared. Because imagine you're defending a system which is so indefensible. You're taking huge amounts of money from some of the most disreputable people in the world. You really don't want to have a debate in public about it. But it's easy at my age. I'm not trying to get promotion anymore. I'm not even trying to get another job. I'm happy to hang around where I am. So it's easier for some people than it is for others. The real bullying in universities is bullying in your own mind. It's the panopticon. And it's the panopticon of the ref and other things, where people actually self-police themselves and behave in certain ways. And those systems were partly set up to do that. I have sat in a meeting at the Department for Education here where the other advisor, so I'm not going to name him and he may be in the room, this is true, he'll know, because he also works in university, not Dominic Cummings but Gove's other educational advisor, said of this system of school testing and so on, and comparing schools, the important thing is that the teachers think they're being monitored. It doesn't actually matter if we are or not. As long as they think they're being monitored, they'll behave how we want them to behave. And it's the same with university systems of teaching excellence and ref. Often the people who designed it actually believe that what they're doing is good, but the way in which they get you to do what they want you to do is to get you to self-police yourself. And once you stop doing that, it's easy. It's a bit like once you get arrested for the first time, it's dramatically less frightening to get arrested again. But the first time is really hard. And the fact that I think it's brilliant it's the white upper middle class getting arrested, because it's the white upper middle class who pollute the most. So it's completely appropriate who is in Trafalgar Square. It creates a climate of change. I have a friend who's a couple of years younger than me who's Greek academic, and it matters he's that age because he was 15 in the year when almost all Greek children occupied their schools for 3 months and stopped the schools working entirely in Greece. And he can remember being in the main square in Athens and the police coming and all the rest of it. That sets you up for life over how you behave and don't behave later. Of all the countries of Europe, the second worst country for protests is Germany. Only 1 in 3 Germans have ever been in a protest. And the worst country of all EU 28? It's us. Only 1 in 6 people in Britain have ever been on a protest. So we just don't know how to do it. We tug our forelock and we behave. And the brilliant thing about Extinction Rebellion is it's the beginning of the misbehaviour, and it will continue.
There's a history of misbehaviour too.
Yes. But one problem with this legacy of empire is that because we were the richest country in the world, and our working class after a certain point were better off than other people's working class, it was quite easy to actually get people to know their place and stay in it.
Sure.
This is why it's so hard knocking this class system, because it's so deeply rooted that we just don't notice it. I know that my now posh accent says certain things. I will make immediate judgments on you simply from how you look that people in other countries don't do.
We have a few more minutes. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for the talk. So I have a question. I'm sorry if you covered it already in the presentation. So on inequalities, right, what can we do as individuals to be more aware of the different ways or the different privileges that we have and how they might affect other people? I don't know how to explain this, but then there's some things that we go through or that we have. Like you gave an example with the universities, to open up education, to make it more accessible. But then on the individual level, what are the things that we can do to be a bit more aware of how we may be creating more space between us and others, and how to sort of, to try in our own tiny ways to avert that, so we're not getting to the apology side of things, so to try to preempt some of those things. I don't know if it's possible, but what are the tiny things that we can bear in mind?
Can I add one question to that, and then we're going to have to wrap up because we've actually only got 2 minutes. But you mentioned, you showed that slide of your colleague Miles Allen.
Miles Allen, yeah.
So The Guardian has, as we all know, recently invited us not to use the language of climate change, but instead to use the language of climate emergency. So he's saying, no, we have to think about this as rational. We have to think about it in the same way that we thought about slavery, as injustice. So it's not enough to say this is an emergency. We have to see that it's functional and rational in a particular economic setup and challenge that, bring into focus the injustice of that. I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about your thoughts on that dimension. But
yes.
Initially, we have this question about what we can do as individuals.
What we can do. I'll give you just two things you can do. One is very nerdy and one's very human. The very nerdy one you can do is go to the Institute of Fiscal Studies website, IFS website, and I've forgotten the exact page, but you hit it very early on in Google, about where do I stand. And you simply type in your salary, your household's annual income, and for some reason they want your council tax as well, which, and then it'll tell you where you are. And it's the easiest kind of numerical inequality. But the people are so shocked to find that they're in the 10%. I hardly ever talk to anybody who's involved in anything professional who is not in the 10%. But many of them, particularly in London, think they're average and halfway. So the immediate thing it's possible to do, which suddenly shows you a particular kind of privilege you've got. The other thing, which is very human and hard to describe, is 10 years ago, Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett wrote a book called The Spirit Level, and you may have seen them do a talk. And this is just one thing Richard does, which I've noticed, and the fact I noticed it shows how rare it is. Richard Wilkinson talks to everybody around him, always, which means talking to the people behind the counter serving tea. Not saying, can I have a tea, but actually talking with them. And he just does it automatically. And the fact that it is so very odd just shows how screwed up we are. That just talking to people who are not the people you're supposed to talk to for a length of time that is more than 10 seconds has an effect. That's kind of an anecdotal one, but one that's always struck me. I'm a bit shy. He can't help himself. He just does it. The emergency, it's trying to get people to realise that this one is a real one. Because the problem is, I did a book on population 10 billion, and I managed to come up with 42 ways in which life is supposed to end on the planet. Killer Bees is my favourite one, if you remember the movies. But you know, acid bleaching of oceans, the soil being washed off, and some of them have got quite a bit of truth. We're really good at being apocalyptic. And it's quite good because it actually is a warning system. Worrying is very good for you as a species. But the problem is when you have so many, people tend to think, oh, that's just another one. And it's only really in the last 10 years it's become blatantly obvious this is so bad. At school, when I did my geography O-level, to get a high mark at O-level, I had to write about the danger of the Ice Age, which could come at any moment. Right, that's 1984. So this is very, very recent change in knowledge. There weren't many people before. And really, just the last 10 years of summers and so on, I wasn't that worried 15 years ago. I thought it was bad. But it really is going up. And there's lots of ways you can deal with it as well. You know, we could live in a world that's 1.52, I won't get myself in trouble with my colleagues, but you have to live in a far more equitable world. You have to look after each other. You can't compete with each other in that kind of world and expect to get by. And I'll end on the other thing. There's brilliant work going on at the moment. You know, people endlessly talk about climate change, refugees and so on. That isn't about the climate change science. It's largely about bigotry, about refugees. There's lots and lots of good work going on, not yet published, about we have no idea how many people are going to move and in what direction. But we have a fear, prejudice inbuilt about the idea of refugees and people coming. And so some people have used that to try to scare people about the climate. But we don't actually know which way it would go. There's a question to how livable London comes under certain circumstances. And then where do the refugees from London go? And one of the reasons why you want to worry about this is you want to keep people packed into high density cities. You want an urban heat island where they actually heat themselves so that you don't need to spend fossil fuels heating people in winter, because you can tell from this room you are each a little heater, you know, and that's all good. we don't have to do it in a way. The school children are doing it. There's 3 15-year-old girls in my city who are far, far more effective. And then what I'll end on, what's really interesting about this is when it was nuclear war, it was older women. It was my mum, the women at Greenham, the ones who protested. It was more women than men. And it was generally older women who were worried about, because young women and girls knew their place back then, and you'd never gone to protest.
I did.
Oh, you did as young. Well done, well done. You started it early. What's really interesting about this is how young a lot of it is. And the one I'll leave you on just because it's law. It's quite hard arresting people who've got an arrest buddy and advice and know what to do. It's exhausting of police resources and quite difficult. But it's nothing compared to trying to arrest a child. If you arrest a child, the degree of responsibilities you have, what you have to do, the appropriate person who has to be present, it doesn't take many children in Britain being arrested for the authorities not to be able to cope at all. And what we need to be ready for is if and when that begins, whether our response is solidarity or condemnation of who chooses to do that. And our natural instinct in a very conservative country will be, that's terrible, they should be in school. But just remember my friend who was involved for 3 months in Greece at the age of 15, and how it changed his life so that what he does now always has to an effect. He was working on the island of Lesbos, and what does he do on Lesbos as soon as people turn up? You do something, because you've always done something. And if you do something as a child, particularly something when you're told you shouldn't, and it turns out to have been sensible, you can carry on doing that again and again and again.
There's an incredible power there. Unfortunately, our time is up, but we've had the most wonderful and vast tour d'horizon of some of the most urgent and compelling issues of our time. Please join me in thanking Professor Danny Dorling.